Thanks for pressing play, or whatever you did to get here. This is Saints of Cinema. I'm Timothy Winterstein.
And I'm Jay Winterstein.
And
And
you
I'm
can get a
Jason
hold of us.
Swan.
I'm coming to you. You can get a hold of us. I should have said that beforehand. It's my fault. You can get a hold of us, saintscinemapod@gmail.com. Send us an email. Facebook, X, Instagram, YouTube. And we'll put that link down there as well. Also, find all of our episodes on saintscinema.com. This is episode 81, I believe.
Yeah.
This is almost 3 years, Jay. We've been messing around with no one to listen to us. Okay, a couple people listen to us.
Even if no one listened to
Where 2 or 3 are... No. Yeah, we would just do this for fun, which is basically what we're doing anyway. So if you're watching this on YouTube, as you can see, we do have guests. And this is my friend, Pastor Jason Swan, who is from and lives in Nampa, Idaho. I met him in Seattle, but now in Nampa for a few months.
Mm-hmm.
What up? Yeah, so welcome.
Thanks for having me on. Looking forward to it.
So I guess, Tim, maybe you should start off by telling us why Jason's on the podcast. What initiated that?
So the other, I don't know, that was last week, something like that.
About last week.
Week and a half, maybe. I got a text, and he asked if I'd seen a movie called Sinners, and he was like, because I want to talk to you about this particular scene, and so I thought after I saw it, I was like, I bet I know which scene. And so then I sent Jason a text yesterday or the day before saying, hey, you want to come on the podcast? And we'll get into some of that, get into sort of Sinners as a whole, which is an interesting title. And obviously there's some religious significance there. And just in general, all sorts of things going on in that film that are interesting to us. I don't know. What do you guys think just as a whole? Say out of 5 stars, 1 to 10, however you want to rank it. How high is this movie on your list for 2025?
I went 4 stars. I letterboxed it at 4. I think it could have been 4.5. I think I don't know. I had some minor issues with maybe parts of the ending, but I think it's best film of the year so far. It's earlier in the year. But I think there's a lot going on with this film, and I think it's a great film to discuss because it's heavy and there's a lot of metaphors and a lot of things going on. And I think it's just a great film to really dig into on so many different levels. And I think it's kind of what makes film fun instead of just going out and enjoying a film. I think this one's one that you can really dig into it, and there's a lot of things to really think about within the film.
Where are you at, Jason?
I guess I'd go about 4.5. I think in terms of the cinematography, soundtrack, acting performances, everything was as good as I've seen in probably a few years, taken all together. With the ending, I'm kind of with Jay there a little bit. It kind of felt like Return of the King, where you had multiple endings, although I like how the mid-credit scene was a proper 10-minute long, whatever scene it was, to bring some closure, but still an interesting choice. And a couple of characters and elements I was actually really excited to kind of see play out that just dropped off the face of the earth during the course of the film. Was also a little confusing or maybe enticing to see a director's cut or some additional scenes on some bonus features someday, but overall, I just thought it was excellent and just technically well done as well.
What were some of those that the character arc or plot line that you were thinking of?
So I'm thinking of the introduction of the Native American vampire hunters.
Yeah, no, true.
And it was such a striking image at sunset there. They're riding in. It almost had it almost felt like a mini Western in the middle of this period piece with just some of the long shots and the big vista and background and the tension of that scene was really interesting, and I thought especially with some of the different dynamics with regard to uh, race and tensions, especially set in Jim Crow South at that point, to add that extra layer of that Native American, indigenous set of characters, clearly occupying a very unique role that none of the other characters would ever sort of think to be doing. How do they get there? Why do they get
Yeah.
on the villain's trail? What happens to them afterwards? And is there a larger subculture dedicated to fighting this evil that is present or explored more? And it just, maybe it's intriguing for the mental game to kind of play a little bit of headcanon, leaving and having something to chew on. But sort of from the cinematic perspective, it felt like it was going to be more prominent, and then ended up never making an appearance after that.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. And so I sort of like, well, what? And then that's sort of an obvious one where, like, you could have brought them back in some way, probably. Yeah, what? I mean, obviously the scene is to introduce the main sort of bad guy, but you could have done that and made more of that. I think that it would have been interesting. Um,
Yeah, I think because the Native American, that the Choctaw, I believe they are. I think they're facing a lot of the adversities that a lot of the other groups within the film are facing, and there's a lot of similarities. So that's true. That it's something that's presented and then kind of gets overtaken by other things. So that would have been an interesting group to see how that subplot little plays out there.
because you could even have like a triangular, because the if you haven't seen it, probably you should see it before we, because we're just giving all the spoilers. So but the main vampire, okay, that's a big one. uh
There's vampires in the
I
film.
mean,
Look out.
he's kind of focused on that with his ancestors and sort of oppression and things, and so you could have done like sort of a triangular thing between the brothers and sort of the oppression of blacks at that time, and then you have the Native Americans and right. So you have kind of you could have had a three pronged sort of um, examination of that. But maybe that's too much. I mean, the movie's fairly long as it is. So, but yeah, no, that's a good point.
So where do you have it, Tim? How many stars you got it at?
I put 4.5, and it's one of the, I always do stars right away. So sometimes
Yeah,
afterward, I'm
yeah.
like, I read some stuff. I'm like, oh, good point, and then I wanna kind of either lower or raise it. But I'm very persuadable when it comes to ranking movies.
Especially like right when you're out of the theater,
Yeah, yeah,
because I mean, obviously the theater is like the best experience for seeing these, and especially seeing something like this that's so visually impactful, and to come out of the theater and you're kind of like on that little theater high. So I probably
yeah.
probably add an extra half star at least to any theater film I see.
So I mean, there are a lot of things in this movie that, um, I mean, are interesting to us, related to Christianity, related to um, religion, um, and they kind of overlap with some of the other major themes. I mean, it starts off a guy going into a church or driving up and then going into a church.
Yeah, and it finishes
Um,
at the church too.
yeah, and so sort of.
Okay, fair
I
enough.
mean, maybe it finishes at a different kind of church. But the so that's kind of running underneath the thing, and I do want to kind of talk about that as we go. But one of the things that struck me the most, and maybe this is related to sort of just the vampire genre. This is one of the first. I mean, one of the. I don't know. It's been a while since I've seen a vampire movie that did anything extra in some way that I was like, that's really fascinating. And it did it by taking a lot of the common vampire tropes and sort of throwaway ones, like, okay, garlic, holy water, wooden stakes, silver, right? It kind of takes all those and kind of like just they're there. But um one of the things that's always fascinated to me fascinated me is the the similarities, or maybe the, I don't know, it's sort of a negative, I mean, in a photography sense, negative sense or aspect of Christianity. Um, because what's the point of vampires, right? Vampires are, the only way that they sort of survive is on the blood of somebody. That's their, they've got it. They have got to continually have blood. They got to continue. That's how they survive. But they're not really alive. They're eternally dead. And at the same time, they never actually, they go on existing. And I think this is a fascinating um, sort of contrast with Christianity, because at least sacramental Christians um, are going to focus, or are going to have the blood of Christ at the center of um, what we're about. And so, how do you live? The life is in the blood, but it's but but in the Old Testament, there's a prohibition on drinking blood. It's not until Christ comes and says, "Drink my blood," that is a, because there's no blood in the life of, or there's no life in the blood of animals. There's no life in the blood of your fellow man for you. That's only for them. But in Christ, there is life in His blood and eternal life. And I don't know. To me, that's it's just fascinating to me, and I wonder if the origin of the vampire legend is actually, and I think Bram Stoker's Dracula kind of hints at this. But I don't know. As you watch this particular movie, did you see that playing out?
I know
Go
I
ahead,
did.
please.
And I actually couldn't help but think of Midnight Mass as
Mm.
sort of a parallel thing to think about while watching this, because again, you have a lot of the same exploration, at least in terms of spirituality and Christianity, and how they play together, intersect, uh, diverge at different points. And yeah, for me, uh, watching it as a sacramental Christian, especially in light of the Christianity that's presented, is probably going to be more of a non-sacramental Christianity, to see how, long story short, there are some things where I almost could identify with, in terms of the collective unity and the work of the vampires, and how that whole setup plays out, from both a story standpoint, a lore standpoint. It wasn't as unfamiliar to me with how we think through faith as sacramental Christians, to see that portrayed, albeit, yeah, I like that, negative, or like the inverted world, like in Stranger Things or something like that.
Yeah, no, that is interesting because I mean, I guess Christians in this the same way Christians and vampires are kind of, I don't know, on the outskirts, I guess, in a lot of these things. But that's interesting because I don't know, vampires are never considered like part of the good guys, which is something to think about. Whenever they're portrayed, they're never thought of as, hey, these are the good guys coming in to save us. It's always like they're coming to take life,
Yeah.
instead of give it. But I think where you're going, there are some aspects of the whole feeding on the blood. I think that is an interesting aspect to look at in trying, and making a comparison between the two.
I mean, because in this movie, the vampires, at first you're like, okay, these are the bad guys. But when they come and talk to them, and they're trying to convince them to let them in, they're like, let us do this. We can save you from what's going on. We can make it so that you have sort of power and life and authority in a place where you don't, because we know about that. They say, like, join in, like, in terms of communion and sort of eternal happiness. I mean, that's kind of how they're kind of alluring in that way. And in fact, the original, Nosferatu doesn't do this noticeably when Harker goes to the castle. In the book, the vampire is very alluring, and attracts him. In fact, Harker's a little bit
Oh,
worried that he's so
Mhm.
attracted to sort of the darkness, and it doesn't happen in the most recent Nosferatu, but it does happen here, right? Like they're like, here's a way, and all the people who have become vampires are not sad about it. They're like, yeah, this is good. You should come with us. We can fix this, etc. And I think so. There's this kind of temptation to join a group of people who are all kind of getting along together, and they're all like living and they're living forever, right? By means of this blood. And I think that's sort of it's a copy, or it's a an aping of what the Christian claim is, I think. So I found that I found that part of it interesting, that how sort of attractive what they're doing is for people, and yet they're kind of scared of it too.
Oh, that's interesting, because they do definitely see it as, when they see these people coming in, there's definitely that apprehension. They have all these people who are in the juke joint there, and these Irish, the vampires, they don't know they're vampires at this point. But when they come in, there is that apprehension of who are these people, and they're kind of othered in that way, because they're obviously, everyone inside the juke joint they're all African Americans, and then these three white people come in, which initially sets them apart, obviously, and say, okay, what are you doing here? What are these people about? And then I think and then the vampires try to like, hey, they try to calm things, and
Yeah,
let's all
tonight.
for tonight until dawn. Yeah. So I think there's something there to that.
I also, the healing aspect of both their message as well as what actually happens when they get bit and join that community, I thought was a pretty significant thing to me, especially as we see this sort of character arcs play out throughout the course of the movie, and then even at the epilogue in the end. Where do you find healing? Where do you find rest? Where do you find refreshment? And I would say that the healing and rest for all the characters manifests in a variety of ways. Some through sort of a spiritually and religious connection and restoration of relationships, some through the escape of the reality of the situation and the labor in the fields by going to the juke joint, some with the promise of eternal life that is forever freed without pain, sorrow, sadness, segregation, degradation, however you want to phrase it. I think healing and healing through generations is something that is a theme that jumped out to me, especially healing centered around blood, whether it's blood shared through the same sort of cultural and music experiences, i.e. the otherness at the juke joint, whether it's the actual literal blood in the case of the vampires, or whether it's blood in terms of family that has been lost, that is now being remembered. All of that came together centered around this concept for me of healing, and how do we deal with that, and what does that look like, and how does it shape how we look towards the end of all things as well.
Yeah, it's a fascinating thing, like what you said about healing through blood, and you have these various, right? Are you blood? Are you family now, currently? And yet you've got this kind of thing about like vampire blood, and you become part of our family, so to speak. And I think that's a great insight into sort of what's going on, and it's tied to the music, which we'll get to in a minute. But
I think, okay, so making that connection between this Christianity and vampires, I think what's interesting to then take it to the next step is how the vampires are perceived in this film, and how these vampires slash Christians is perceived. Because I think one of the things that came out about this film is that it kind of had maybe an anti-Christian bias. I saw the rapper Lecrae, I don't know if he came out and said that the film was an anti-Christian film. So I think that's something interesting to look at, and just look at how Christianity is perceived, in terms of Christianity as the vampires as Christians, and how they're kind of perceived as taking over everyone else in the film, and kind of just I don't know, sucking
So
their blood, basically.
so you think that, see, because I'm saying that vampires are sort of the inverse, like generally speaking, vampires are the inverse of what Christianity claims to be. Just because it, it's a claim that if you sort of become one of them, and but you got to drink blood, and that is sort of a version of eternal life, but it's really a version of eternal death. Um, because the blood of people, like
Hmm.
they always have to have, you have to have more and more. Like you can't, it's not like you get some and you're like, oh, I'm good. Um, so I was saying it's the inverse, but you're saying that there's sort of been a criticism in terms of the vampires actually representing Christianity.
Yeah, and I think there's a couple things throughout the film that you can look to, or point at. I think I forget his name. What's his name? Delta Slim. I think in the film, what is he? He
Hmm.
mentions, what's his quote? The blues wasn't forced on us like religion was, and it kind of goes to the whole. I mean, a big theme of the film is this appropriation of black culture and black music, and basically that. And I think even Remick, the vampire, mentions it at one time, the same similar thing that the religion was forced on my ancestors, way back in the day, and how basically we didn't want it, but yet Christianity came and kind of just took over us.
I see that theme and it popped out, but at the same time, spoiler alert for those watching who haven't seen it, towards the climax of the film, you have this inversion of baptism in which Preacher Boy is dunked 3 times into the water as he begins to recite the Lord's Prayer, sort of as his last. I mean, it would be his last words as far as we would know
Mm-hmm.
prior to the attack and what should have been his conversion, if you will, to being a vampire. So he goes to the Lord's Prayer unironically in his last moments, and Remick, as you point out, is reminded of how that was forced on him and his family and his descendants back in Ireland 1,000 years ago. But yet, at the same time, in the process of trying to mock the very thing that is seen as an interloper, it actually is the means to his downfall. So as he, dunks 3 times as you would in a baptismal ceremony, that's when the sun rises. And it's almost like he then becomes an inversion of Elijah, in which the whirlwind of fire takes him not up to heaven, but in a sense to Sheol or perdition or absolute destruction and unbeing, if you will. So that's where it's interesting. That's why I love this film, because there's so many layers where I just would love to have like an hour to sit and talk with Ryan Coogler
Yeah,
and
right.
just bounce some of these ideas off of him, because I don't think, unlike other and probably lesser skilled writer and directors, uh, I don't think he's as obvious in terms of some of his criticisms. I do think that there are some multivalent themes that uh, are intentionally up for discussion to be able to make the audience think and really reflect on some of the larger ideas that he's presenting in the course of the film.
Yeah, it's not an all encompassing criticism, and and in that way he really is, I think, a lot like Mike Flanagan, who has said that he's sort of this lapsed Catholic, and that all of the imagery sort of comes in, and it's in a lot of ways there are a lot of things that are sort of overt criticisms of institutional religion, let's say. At the same time, it's almost like you can't avoid the images that tell a different kind of story. And I think Midnight Mass is a great comparison because I have people I know who pastors, for example, who hated that show and thought it was sort of just explicit rejection of Christianity. In my mind, that was a showing what happens when you corrupt Christianity by sort of power and your own sort of narcissistic need to control things. I mean, that's sort of what happens. He's the old pastor priest finds this vampire, and because he can't let go of things, he's got to this is his attempt to try and continue on. So for me, it is a criticism of a certain kind of religion, but the deeper themes, as you say, there's kind of a, I mean, maybe it's unintentional. Maybe it's sort of outside of his what he's after explicitly, and yet it's like it almost can't. He almost can't help it. There are these other things that are below the surface, which the vampire act. I mean, what does he say? He says something like, "This is forced on us, but what I still find comfort in,"
Oh,
something like that.
I find comfort in those words
For,
as well.
yeah.
Yeah, yeah, which is an intriguing, right? So like, okay, maybe the way it came to you was sort of contrary to the gospel. I mean, I don't know exactly what the storyline there, but maybe there's something else going on behind it. But
Yeah, that's true that it came in a more of a threatening way, but the at the basis, the truth, that is something that maybe stuck with him. Um, yeah, and I think there's a lot of those themes that you can see throughout the film that there's you can go either way on, where he's not fully definitive on one way, trying to explicitly say one thing and against another. Looking back, there are a bunch of instances where you could say, well, he did this, okay, but he also did this, so maybe it's not fully indicative of one thing or
I
the
mean,
other.
the clearest criticism of the church and religion, I think the most sort of obvious thing that happens in the movie is sort of in that scene that begins and ends the main part of the movie where his dad is like, put down the guitar, in the name of God, put down the guitar. And we find out that he leaves and he keeps the guitar. And so to me, this is sort of like music is his church. And we'll come back to Jason's point about the music and the particular scene. But I think that's sort of the more overt thing is that he gives up sort of at least that version of Christianity for the sake of music, which sort of is his church, I think. But
Although, how much of it is also even more so rejection of his father, too? Not just Christianity, but a Christianity that his father wants him to take up to follow in his footsteps, where, as Lutherans, we would talk about the idea of vocation. And it's okay even for pastors' kids to not necessarily have the vocation of pastor following the steps of their father. And, sort of the pastor and dad in me kind of wonders if his dad had a better understanding of vocation and allowed him to explore those musical gifts and even the form of the music itself without having the outright hostility, if that would have changed his trajectory. Because I think we see that play out over and over again. And the other thing I thought of this while watching it and thinking back to Midnight Mass, but the difference at the end with the vampires and how they approach the rising of the sun. I think one of the most striking images of any media, whether it be longer form in terms of like a limited miniseries like Midnight Mass or movie, is I think they sing "Nearer, My God" to the on the island at the end of Midnight Mass, kind of accepting and being resigned to their fate, recognizing that they bought into a false god that has proven to be, rather than their salvation, their destruction. In a way, reset and reorient to the status quo. Whereas in Sinners, there just was, the utter and abject fear at the rising of the sun, and no trying to embrace a different path or the prior path. I don't want to read too much into that, but I just couldn't help but think that both had very similar endings, but yet very different responses to the people, both in terms of how they got to that situation and how they sort of, again, find healing and rest even in the face of death.
so let's talk. Jay, we're gonna say something. Okay, let's talk a little bit about the music. I mean, obviously, from the very beginning, this is the blues. I mean, that's how it starts with the sort of mythology about certain people have the certain talent and music that can conjure up either sort of benevolent type spirits or maybe some malevolent ones, right? And so you have both of those things visually portrayed in the action in the movie itself. One inside the juke joint, and then also with, and this is actually a plot point that, I mean, it's sort of hinted at, and maybe it's explicitly mentioned like one time. Like, why are they after this guy? Well, because they want to sort of reconnect with their ancestors, something to that effect. Um,
Oh,
it's not that that
you talking about Remick, the vampires, and
yeah,
why they're going
yeah,
after
yeah,
Sammy, the guitar player.
yes. So you have, so it he brings about both this scene in the juke joint, and also he's the one who's sort of, so he's sort of at the, I hesitate to say the word crux, but he's at the crux of of bringing both of these things about. So, Jason, say a little bit about how you sort of experienced that scene the first time you saw it.
So the first time I saw it was moved to tears, and immediately I thought of in the liturgy the Sanctus. So in the communion liturgy, we have the proper preface, and it ends with the angels and archangels and the whole company of heaven. We laud and magnify your glorious name, evermore praising you and singing, Holy, holy, holy. And in the confession of our theology, we recognize that in a mystical way that transcends human ability to perceive or understand, we are connected to the saints who have gone before us and are also united with them in the real and true life that they have with the resurrected Lord. And so for me, watching that scene and seeing the generations, in a sense, going both backwards and forwards, conjoining into one spot, intentional or otherwise, was probably the best representation of the Sanctus in terms of how we confess it in a very cosmic, across time and space sense in our theology. And I was moved to tears, especially because when I was watching it, I noticed that everybody who was there, in a sense, their ancestors and forebears, or going backwards or looking ahead, who would to come after them, are all a part of it. Whether it's the Chinese merchants and their dancing and their music being folded in, whether it's the different layers all the way going back to places like West Africa, or looking ahead to the future with people like Jimi Hendrix and Run DMC, or some of the other musical incarnations that would come through that shared collective music experience. For me, was just a very moving, and I couldn't help but think immediately of the Sanctus and the connection between the ages, and not just sort of a connection that we imagine, but one that, in a sense, is very physically tied in through the music and the singing. So that's what initially started my reflection on that, and everything else kind of flowing out of that, because I do want to say that might be almost the literal central point of the film in terms of both runtime, but also the transition from the first half in the examination and building up of the characters to the second half, which is almost more of that classic vampire story.
So that's interesting because that scene is such, when it gets the capital THE scene when you think about this film, because that scene it's so unexpected. I think when it comes out, it's so removed from the film, and because of that, I think you're forced to focus on it and just really pay attention to it. But hearing you mention it is really interesting to think about, all the hymns and all the things that we sing now and their connection to. I mean, we sing hymns from like what, the 1500s, 1600s, from hundreds of years ago, and all the people that have been singing these hymns before us, and then how
700s, 400s,
700, yeah,
I mean,
and how that
we've
brings
got hymns
that
that go back.
connection. Yeah, no, and it's fascinating to think, because I'm pretty sure Kugler wasn't thinking of Lutheranism and singing hymns, or maybe it was when he put that together. But it is interesting how you can take that and relate that across.
In fact, that I said this thing to my wife as we left. How that I said, I think this is the scene that Jason was thinking about, and here's the reason. And she's like, we actually got in an argument about the Lord's Supper. Not that she doesn't believe it, but we sort of got an argument about sort of the extent of this point exactly, about the body of Christ. And I'm like, well, there's only one body of Christ, and so if Jesus is present, the entire body of Christ has to be present there with him. And so she was, you know, she grew up in a sort of non-denominational sort of environment, and so I don't think it was. I think it was probably much more about the individual relationship to Jesus, and so the idea of the whole communion of the saints together as the body of Christ was probably not, sort of at the forefront of it. And so she's saying, like, where do we sort of get this in the scriptures? And I'm thinking, I'm thinking Revelation, the people of every tribe and language and nation gathered around the throne and around the Lamb. You have Ephesians, on the body of Christ, Corinthians on the body of Christ, right? So you have kind of all of these pieces that are picked up in the Sanctus, or in the proper preface, to sort of deal with, uh, sort of emphasizing that here is the place where you are most closely connected, to the body of Christ, and it's this mystical communion that is, maybe not emphasized enough, maybe not enough.
And within that scene, like, nobody's taken out of it, and it is part of that communion. Like, everybody is involved and within it, and taking part of it, at the same time, which is just, I guess, just another aspect of that.
And that's where, again, thinking through this, it's not just even a Lutheran thing. I think pretty much all sacramental Christians would not have too much of a quibble with sort of that description of what happens during that particular part. And it's kind of interesting. I also, along the same lines, couldn't help but think of Tolkien a little bit, because in how he sets up and designs the Middle Earth universe, sort of music as a binding thing across the ages, and in a sense across time and space itself, is baked into the foundation of his world as well. And again, as somebody who was heavily Catholic, as Tolkien was, he would have known exactly what something like the Sanctus would have meant. So I couldn't also help but see some of the parallels between how Tolkien sets up the idea of music being a connecting force across the ages and across dimensions. I don't know if you would use that word, but we might in our current setting now, just as Kugler did with how Preacher Boy and his musical ability. And I think the form of the music, too, also informs why it is such a powerful force as well. But I couldn't help but think of Tolkien a little bit, too, in terms of how he does a similar sort of thing in his world building.
What do you make of the fire at that point, and the apparent burning down of that building, so that it's sort of open to everything? Is that, I mean, how would you sort of fit that in? And that's one thing that sort of was surprising to me in that scene. It wasn't just that they're sort of going backwards and forwards in time, but there's sort of this the rafters start burning, and then they can see in there.
I think my initial thought was just the energy of the place. Is that kind of what the fire was, just kind of a reaction to the energy and the excitement of everything that was going on. And then I guess maybe just a precursor to the place burning down. But in that moment, when I initially saw it, I think it was just part of the excitement of that scene. I think is how I took it when my initial watch.
And for me, I along the same lines, and I think it maybe also in terms of the stripping away of the purely physical to move into that spiritual realm, because even just on a more meta scale in terms of how Kugler handles religion. It's not just, talking about Christianity, but I do think there is still like an acknowledgement, even if it's sort of an animistic hoodoo religion or spirituality, that there is something beyond sort of our plane of existence that the vampires understand, Remick understands and wants to be a part of, and fundamentally can't by nature of his being. But seeing the true humans, if you will, being able to experience that real connection to eternity that even though Remick is theoretically an eternal creature, he actually can't experience because of his unaliveness, where true life, even if it's a life in a world that is filled with death, through that, again, connective musical and mystical spiritual force, is something that Remick longs for, and he can see for himself. And I was kind of wondering, and I would be curious what you guys think about, can Remick see all of the ancestral elements and the future elements? Because the way Kugler shoots it, it almost looks like Remick is seeing for himself the vision of all of the people spanning across the centuries before it snaps back to sort of the present time when the walls are back up once again. So there's this brief image where Remick sees or at least it looks like he sees the burning building, but everybody dancing, all the ages, all at once.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think the way that the perspective of that shot appears to be from Remick's perspective. So I think, I mean, that makes sense to me. I think he can see it from the outside, but he's not if he has not been invited in, he's not part of it. There's
there seems to be that communal thing within the vampires. Even when I think Remick gets hit in the head at the end, they all kind of like, oh, or and then when one of them dies, they kind of all feel it. So there is that sense of they're all they all sense each other, and also even past vampires, they kind of have that sense of feeling of one another amongst themselves. And I don't know,
two different versions of the same kind of thing, which is sort of my point about vampires and Christianity. But here is a different angle on a similar thing where they are basically trying to do the same thing, and they have their own sort of music and dance thing,
right,
Irish version, and so I mean, and then there's a song that they repeat about the picking the bones clean, the Jaybird. Oh. That I forget exactly how it goes now, but
yeah, I think there's something to that song too.
It's kind of a menacing. It sounds like a happy tune, but maybe not so happy.
It's interesting because like you mentioned, they do have their own music, and yet at the same time, it's not enough for them. They want Sammy's voice. Like, we have ours, but that's not enough. We need to be feeding.
They can't bring their ancestors into the picture by their own what they've got. Which is why they're after him. That's what they say. Even though I don't know how. I think you could easily miss that line of dialogue, what he says about why he's after him. I think it'd be easy to sort of miss that. But that's what they say, is they need him in order to whatever magic, whatever it is that's in sort of his music, which is sort of this is what people claim for art, even though most of the time it's not transcendent. But it can be, and I think that's not necessarily it doesn't have to be anti-Christian for it to be transcendent. But
sorry, say that again. Well, because you were talking about like the power of the music.
Yeah, because that's sort of that's from the beginning, from the mythology, right? There's some people who can play or sing or whatever, and they can sort of. It's almost like they can cross the barriers between in time and space. I mean, right? So they can conjure up, whether it's their ancestors, whether it's some benevolent spirit, or like a good time, or whether it's
Hmm.
sort of, malevolent spirits like these vampires, right? They have the ability to open those, you know, break down those barriers that are normally there, right? Um,
And yeah,
and
it
I,
kind of
and
goes. Sorry to cut you off, but the power of, I mean, the music and the guitar. Because when, I mean, I think there's like the close up of that initial scene when he walks in and he's bloodied. He's holding the guitar, and it kind of just goes to show the impact of that guitar and the power of the guitar slash music and what it's able to do. Just to go along with like what you were saying there.
And the other thing kind of going with that music that I couldn't help but think of, again, coming from sort of a Lutheran Christian perspective, is blues, and by extension, I think the folk music, whether it's sort of that Southern or Appalachian folk music with what is it, "Pick His Body Clean" or something like that, as well as the Irish folk music, has a definite theology of the cross to it, like blues does, where there's an acknowledgement of the hardships and sorrow and travails of life on the side of glory, and there's not a dismissing it or working around it or ignoring it, but in a sense, leaning into it as a means by which to find joy or to find healing, hope, or even just to lament. But lament in such a way that can be very celebratory, even if you don't see an immediate resolution, because you know that there can be an immediate resolution. For me, that was, I think, a big part of understanding sort of every side that had a lot of commonality, and yet in many ways were worlds apart as well.
No, no, that point struck me about Lamentation, when they're in the car and he's telling the story. They go past the chain gang, and he's telling the story of his friend, right? And then they kind of just naturally lean into this blues, which, we talk about sort of flippantly about, oh, I've got the blues or whatever, right? Like that sort of a flippant thing, but at the same time, there's this deep lamentation in the middle of circumstances, and very often in a spiritual sense. Like, what are you going to do with this? And I think Christianity, although even if we haven't tapped into it very often, it has those deep resources in the Psalms, for example, lament Psalms, obviously the Book of Lamentations, things like that. You've got these resources to draw on in the middle of circumstances, whether that's, sort of just fundamental oppression in the society, persecution, etc., or if it's just sort of just your own circumstances that you're going through. Um, but that's I think it's a very strong theme. What Why they do what they do, and what, I mean, they even say, like, what, you're too young to play the blues, right? But he has his own experience, and that feeds what he's doing. So, I think that's, yeah, I think that's definitely there.
Yeah, it's interesting that I think in a lot of ways the blue. Yeah, going off what you said, there is a like a religiosity almost to the blues and how it's treated and how it's brought up in the film.
I mean, yeah. So you have, um, I mean, I think throughout, like I said, I think you could take the ending, or before the credits and in the middle of the credits, you could take the ending as a replacement of religion, I think. Uh, or I think I think it's totally valid, because I think Lutherans can understand this. You don't have to be in, like, church work to be doing uh, holy work. Jason, you brought up the idea of vocation, which I think is a significant one. That you could play music, you can be a Christian, you can play music. You don't have to play music in the church. You could be doing something. You don't have to be doing it in the church for it to be meaningful and holy, because it's not about the work or it's not about the work or the location of it so much as it is about whether the person is holy. And I've been reading. I have right now. I'm taking a class, theology of vocation, and a lot of these authors that I'm reading focus on the work, or they focus on the location of it, or they focus on sort of creation as sort of generally holy. And I mean, there's something to all of that. At the same time, I think the Lutheran contribution to that is significant and unique in that it focuses on the relationship of someone who's holy in Christ to the people around them and what they're doing for in service to them, and it's not and that's actually God serving that person. So I think you could take it either way, and depending on where you're coming from, you're going to take it opposite ways. But
To kind
I
of
don't know.
play off of that,
Any thoughts on
so
that before we?
yeah, just a little bit. I mean, I think it's interesting the utilization of This Little Light of Mine as one of the foundational songs coming out of the Christian tradition. And we kind of extrapolate the lyrics. This little light of mine, I'm going to let it shine. But kind of going back to what you're saying, a good understanding of vocation recognizes that the light can shine outside of the walls of the church and how we live out our day to day living and being. And so for me, the utilization of that song, and I don't really think it was meant to be sort of ironic or, um, trying to undermine what it's saying, but rather kind of pointing out that the light can shine in a variety of ways. Now, I think it's pretty clear in the movie the light can shine, through, the hoodoo and some of the other spiritual connections that people make outside of sort of what we would say the bonds of Christian theology. But the reality is the idea for Kugler, I think, is still there about the spiritual connectivity and the light that comes through a genuine relationship, whether it's between brothers, mother, father, children who have been lost, etc. I think that comes through in multiple sequences, and I do think the utilization of that in the context of the movie, in terms of that particular Christian song, was somewhat appropriate, given the larger overall thrust of the narrative.
Yeah, yeah, that is
I, th-
interesting. Yeah, go ahead.
I was just going to say, I think this is something that has struck me in the last year or so, that the way we normally approach films or literature or TV show or pretty much any kind of art that is not propaganda or that's not sort of like on the nose with its message. The way that we approach that is, well, it's all or nothing, right? And this is the way I think most Christians approach things like this. It's either giving me like um, all sort of what we understand to be Christianity, or it's nothing. And I think that's probably the way most people right now are approaching everything. It's all or nothing. It's us or them, etc. But I think this is an interesting test case because you have things that are clearly, like you say, sort of the religious aspects. Here's this, wear this sachet of whatever herbs and things are in there, and that will protect you. You have sort of these other aspects of various kinds of religious things that are not Christianity. Um, and yet, there are deep Christian themes running through this. And I think we need, as Christians, need to expand. I'll just get on my soapbox for just a minute. We need to expand the way that we think about things. It's not, I mean, you can't expect sort of, oh, well, if it's not entirely what everything that I think it should be, well, then it's not good. Well, I mean, this is a well-made movie that's not, I mean, you could, if you, depending on where you're coming from, interpret it as an anti-Christian movie. You could do that. I didn't read was it an interview, Jay, with Lecrae or?
I think he just went on social media and said, "Hey, this is great. Like, it's a great film, visually done. It's great for black artists." But basically saying, I think he said Christianity takes the L on this one.
Yeah, I mean, so you that's obviously an open interpretation, and yet, as we've sort of gone through this entire hour, like here are a number of things that sort of lean into, imply, uh, hint at, whatever, very deep Christian themes. And you don't, it doesn't have to be all or nothing. I mean, why would we, unless you, what kind of art is that is sort of like, well, every single thing I believe is all there.
Yeah.
I mean, that
And
I
if
don't,
it's not, then
yeah, that's probably not good art. I don't know.
Yeah.
I know Jason has thoughts on art and Christianity.
Well, I can't help kind of getting briefly just talking about Tolkien. I mean, he has this idea of eucatastrophe. So the cross is the chief catastrophe that ends up turning things from evil to good. But it also is the source of, in a sense, all myths. So all myths flow out of the one true myth, which in his utilization, and Lewis would talk in the same way, is just story. But this story happens to be true and physical and real. But it doesn't mean it doesn't impact all the other stories across the world and across culture and language, where it can't help but leak out, even if the culture, the people who are making it themselves have no connection, or even in some cases outright hostility to the Christian message because of the power of the eucatastrophe of the death and resurrection of Jesus. You can't help but have these major thematic elements pour out from human storytelling, because ultimately the human story is bound up and, from our perspective, points to and finds its fulfillment on Good Friday and Easter in the death and resurrection of Christ. So that's where I think I wholeheartedly agree. We not only need to be comfortable with, but maybe rejoice in those opportunities to really dive into uh, pieces of fiction, works of art, cinema, movies, whatever it is, and not just completely embrace it just because it says the same thing, or completely reject it because it doesn't say the thing. But rather, let's throw in a little bit of nuance and tension, and really wrestle with the artist, and how that frames our existence here on this side of glory.
I mean, because honestly, I would much rather have somebody where there's that tension. And I don't know where Ryan Coogler's coming from. I don't know, what his background is, or in terms of religion or whatever. But in some ways, the bad theology that's in what gets marketed as Christian movies, that churches buy out the theaters to go see these movies, the often bad theology in those movies, but we embrace it because it's edifying, or because it's not going to be, because it's morally sort of anodyne, or whatever the case may be. Um, Sometimes the bad theology in there, to me, is worse than having a sort of conflicted or tension filled description of things that may or may not interact with Christianity. And this is why I think that it shouldn't be all or nothing. It should probably be more or less. That's how I think we should probably approach things like this. Is sometimes it's going to be more in line with our story. Sometimes it's going to be less in line with the story. Sometimes it's going to be anti the story. I mean, that's certainly possible. But in all of those cases, it can't help but, as you said, deal with the one story that there is. Finally, that's the Christian perspective. Is there is finally one story. There is the story of that God is telling in Jesus Christ, and stories are going to be more or less true, or more or less interacting with that. But they're, unless it's the scriptures themselves, they're. I mean, this is something that Christians should realize, right? No matter what the movie is, unless it's not the Bible, right? So if it's not the Bible, then it's always more or less. Like, you're never going to get, even if it's a depiction of the Bible, even if it's The Chosen or whatever it is, it's not the Bible. So you kind of have to. It's always going to be more or less, and it's strange that Christians have trouble realizing that sometimes, and I get a little frustrated. If you can't tell.
Oh, I think anytime you have a film like this that just, puts out the idea of religion, and however it's shown or however it's received, I think what it does is you're going to get people looking at it, and you're going to get people, discussing it. And I think maybe more than anything, that's the best you can hope for there. Is because then a lot of times seeing something that maybe you don't agree with, but maybe it'll reinforce, what you did, and saying, well, this is why I think that's wrong, or this is why I think that's right. And then it just kind of reinforces, what it is true and what is right.
I think sometimes it forces you to steel man a perspective when you see it artistically and well crafted and put before you. And even if it's the less side of things, it still forces you to interact with it in its best iteration, if you will, which can only strengthen our own understanding, but also deepen our appreciation and ability to communicate with the larger world around us, whether they're inside the church or not, or whether they have a deep foundation of faith or no connection to faith. It still allows us to be agile with the thinking, appreciative of the gifts that people are blessed with and are sharing in their vocations, and work towards being able to have those dialogues and conversations that lead to the deeper discussions and open the door again to the greatest story ever told.
Absolutely. So I'd be interested to hear from you. I think going through that lens of what we were just talking about, how you see the ending scene. I know, sorry, spoiler alert. But after
Stick through the mid credits, okay? Which I
well,
think
no,
they
okay,
actually do a good job of keeping. Or are you talking about the very end of the
I
before the
wasn't.
credits?
I was talking about before the credits,
Okay,
when
okay, okay. Go
after
ahead.
Smoke
Sorry.
has died and he's essentially reunited with his ex-wife and child. I'm interested to hear what both of your thoughts are on that scene, and how that relates back to the religion within the film.
So I was thinking of the contrasting visions of peace and healing that, in a sense, we see between Smokestack and the Preacher Boy. You have a vision of healing and peace that involves a reuniting with loved ones on the spiritual plane, if you will,
Mm-hmm.
where you find sort of eternal rest from life on this side of glory. For Preacher Boy, you see a vision of peace and healing that comes through. I like that phrase that Timothy used earlier, the church of music, where he rejects the final vision of peace and healing that embraces sort of the very materialistic and um, bloody view, the very fleshy view of peace and healing that the vampires have as a part of their ongoing reality. And so all of them have things that are appealing, and you can't, from the perspective of the characters, outright dismiss. But at the same time, even though the differences may be subtle for all three of those characters, for Smoke and Stack and for Preacher Boy, it does present an interesting way to sort of conceptualize where we would find, and others around us would find, peace and healing sort of at the end of our life, at the end of our stories, if you will, moving forward into the future.
Yeah, as you say that, there's a prayer in Compline, the prayer at the end of the day about, give us peace at the end of our day, at the end of our life, and at the end of the world. And so that, I think everybody's sort of looking for peace in some way or another. And you do have these kind of contrasting visions in the movie itself. But what's going to sort of bring me peace? And the allure of the vampires is just let us bring you into our existence. Then you'll have peace, because you will sort of be undying, and nobody can harm you, nobody can oppress you, no, right? At the same time, through music or uh, um, sort of the hope of reuniting with loved ones, right? Like all of these, what's interesting to me is like all of those sort of deeply human desires. Christianity claims to be the place where those actual desires have their actual fulfillment. Um, you know, but they can only sort of be that through the resurrection of Jesus. And I think that's obviously the stumbling block, and the cross always was and it always will be. But those desires, those are the same desires everybody has. Peace. Uh, what about these people I've loved here who are gone now, etc., etc.? I think. What about the thing I love to do in this world? What is the reality of that? And I think C.S. Lewis in The Last Battle actually probably has the best fictional account of what that looks like of anything that I've ever read. In terms of it's the same but greater, or it's at least connected, but it's a greater reality beyond anything we could sort of imagine for ourselves. I mean, maybe that's the thing. That's sort of the limit, right? What can we imagine for ourselves? It's infinitely greater, and that's sort of the Christian message. How did you take that?
Yeah, I think just going off kind of like what Jason was mentioned, I think the overall feeling of that scene is just they're at peace, after everything they've gone through, all the hardships. I think they were married and then divorced because of the death of this child. And then the ending, they're kind of brought together again. And I think it's kind of implied that they're going to be together forever, perhaps like in the afterlife. And it is very much like a scene of a peaceful ending, almost like a happy ending, I guess. They're reunited and everything. They walk off into the sunset, so to speak. But
And maybe it's taking it too far, but in that relationship, it's almost like the ending of Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, where you have a sort of violent climax to this particular thing, and then peace, and which is not unrelated to at least how Revelation pictures the conclusion of things. Although in Revelation there's not really violence; it just ends. The Lord, there's no fighting, in other words, but certainly a war or a battle.
yeah,
It's
sorry,
yeah, go
just
ahead.
just
No,
just a
go
little,
ahead.
because
Go
he
ahead.
does. I mean, he just fought two battles, after going all night against the vampires, and then he survives that. He's exhausted, and then I think you mentioned, Jason, at the beginning, kind of like the double ending. You're like, okay, he made it, he survived. He's like the lone survivor, I think, out there. And then all of a sudden, the white supremacist, the KKK, comes in, and he's got to like, all right, let's go again. But yeah, so yes, he does. He's fighting multiple battles here.
On a little bit lighthearted of a note, I had the same sort of pumping of my fist at the killing of the KKK as I did at Inglorious Bastards when they shot up the Nazi high command in the movie theater. It's the sort of like, yeah, I don't usually like violence, but I just couldn't help but go get him. You got this.
Just that great shot of where he's like holding the machine gun and just going at him. It's just a great shot. It's a good one.
Yeah. So maybe to close, let's just talk briefly about the kind of mid credits, post credits scene where I mean I think what you expect is sort of what they're after, which is okay, now finally they've caught up with him and they're gonna take him. Right? Like that's kind of I feel like if you were sort of following the arc of, oh, here they are, and the bouncer let him in. That's sort of like now it's over, and yet these vampires have a little more human feeling than most vampires, I think.
But it gives a more humanistic feeling. It's I don't know, maybe almost rethink it. Like maybe I don't hate these guys as much. Maybe there is some humanity in them. There is this sense of I don't have to kill everybody, which is interesting. And again, it kind of I don't know, softens the blow at the end, I guess.
Yeah, and for me, that I think recently, I think some vampire adaptations almost see them as like a force of nature. and certainly the initial vampire in Flanagan's Midnight Mass is kind of like that. The angel is sort of this other creature that's beyond the existence of the rest of humanity. But the ones who come out of that creature, who themselves become vampires, retain their humanity in a way that's fundamentally different than their creator. And I think both, even with Remick, you still see the remnants of his humanity there. It's less of this idea of a force of nature or a deep sense of otherness, and more of humanity twisted and held up as to maybe what could be ideal under certain circumstances and situations, at least from their perspective as vampires, but still humanity. They still have a deep longing for that human connection, whereas I think a lot of times another vampire writing cinema lore, sometimes it's almost either a force of nature or a deep sense of otherness that has no relation to humanity other than cattle.
Yeah. So good. I don't know. I don't know. We'll see what happens the rest of the year, but right now it's number one for me. So we'll see. But Jason Swan, thanks for being on Saints of Cinema, and we really appreciate you sort of catalyzed me to want to see this, and then I heard other people talking about it. I'm like, gotta see it. So if I can, I'm gonna try to see it again. So anyway, if you're listening, thanks for listening, and get a hold of us, send us an email, all the places. We'll put in the links. And thanks again, Jason.
Thanks for having me.